very much, Dr. Wu. It's nice to be here. I'm really here to offer further thanks for the wonderful sculpture that blesses our Carter Center now as of yesterday, and I'll be speaking more about that. I do have to make a couple of opening qualifications, however. I'm not exactly sure, and I'm not sure you will be when I'm done, who constitutes a peace professional. As you could tell from Dr. Hu's introduction, I like to think of myself as a professional, but my mother-in-law is still not convinced I have a profession. And it is hard to categorize. It seems, though, if we are moving toward friendship, the least I could do is to do this presentation in Chinese, which I am incapable of doing, and particularly for Professor Zhou, because I really want to pay tribute at some length to the sculpture that he so wonderfully created for our center and for Georgia State. If you're looking for a peace professional, you go further than the front row here. Jennifer Smith, my colleague from the Carter Center, could deliver the speech in Chinese, which is the highest compliment one can pay to friends, or one of the highest compliments. And maybe she will be here a lot faster than it took me to get here. She'll be a lot younger when you ask her in my compliment position. So Jennifer, I think there's no chance of that. But listen, yesterday it was a great pleasure to see also Mark Becker, from President of Georgia State at the Carter Center. So I was talking to Professor Becker afterwards, and I said, you know, I'm not really sure what I'm going to talk about today with the association, other than I want to come and give thanks. And he said, yes, it's really difficult to know your audience. He said, we have a son who's living in China, and he speaks Chinese. And I go to China now all the time, Mark Becker said. And he said, you know, I'm not sure our son understands how to get along in China, because he's dating a young woman who he likes very much, and she wants him to come meet her mother. And the father, Professor Becker, thinks that's a major step down the road from what he studies Chinese culture. He doesn't think the son knows what the son is doing. Now that's one concern. So it gave me pause that I might not know my audience, and I called our son, Matthew Stremlaw, who is a biochemist at the University of California, San Francisco. And he has fluent Chinese, and he worked in China in a stem cell lab. And I said, Matthew, how should I talk to the Association of Chinese Professionals? And he said, well, Dad, Chinese are really tired of listening to Americans and Europeans talking to them all the time. Why don't you listen? And I said, well, my task is not to listen, but it's to speak. And so I approached this undertaking with those qualifications. So let me speak for a few moments about the beautiful statue that we have in our foyer. Yesterday, our president, John Hardman, said that this was a miniature of the Georgia State large 5-meter sculpture. That's not quite true. It is smaller, but we were given very generously by our friends in the association the choice of having a 5-foot or 5-meter statue or a smaller statue. And I argued with my colleagues for a smaller statue because no one would see it if it was outdoors. And I think a sculpture, if it's a good sculpture, should be enjoyed and should be inspiring to those who pass by it. And so I wanted it inside, and as I said yesterday, I am very, very pleased that it is at the gateway, the doorway to the Peace Pavilion of the Carter Center, so that all of the workers, including myself, see it as the first thing we encounter going in the door in the morning and as we come out the door in the evening. Now, I want to think a little bit about what Professor Zhou had in mind when he created this. And I think what I'd like to do in setting up this discussion about who is a peace professional is to say a few words about my interpretation of the sculpture. I did some of that yesterday. Share with you a few personal reflections on U.S.-China relations in the career experience I have had, to sort of reflect on what the sculpture means in that context. Highlight some of the work of the Carter Center that may be of interest to you in the association, and then finally get around to offering a few words about becoming a peace professional. I suspect you already are peace professionals. You have come here, learned our language, learning about our culture, are bridging the two countries. It seems to me you're a lot further along than I am. And as a brief aside, this idea of professionalism is, in my culture, very central to my growing up in a small town in Connecticut. My father was a dentist, and he worked in a building called the Professional Building on Main Street. Sounds very American town in Connecticut. And I was very proud of my father for working in the professional building. Professionals in my town were not rich. Professionals in my town were helping the citizens in services they valued. Professionals in my town were looked to as examples to admire and to emulate. So as a small boy, I was very proud to be associated with a professional family. My mother had been a school teacher during the Depression here. Women couldn't continue to work because there were too few jobs, and so she, once she got married, quit her job. That was always, I thought, very unprofessional, to tell you the truth, of the policy of the day, of the government of the day, but that was what it was. And yet she then took on voluntary duties in town, still always being a professional, but no longer able to practice her profession. But in our evolving society, I came away with this deep respect for those who call themselves and live by the standards of professionalism. And so I just want to mention that in passing because I think it's terribly important to think about as we contemplate the sculpture and the message that Professor Zhou has given us. Professor Zhou's sculpture, as you know, is called the Word, one word, but in fact it's two words, peace and friendship. And I think linking the two words is very important. When I arrived at the Carter Center, I was given charge of the peace program. And we did a strategic review, and I said, I think the name has to be changed, at least as we think about it in our practice. And my recommendation, which was accepted by our board, was that it should be peace with justice. Because as Martin Luther King said, peace is not just the absence of tension, the absence of conflict, it's the presence of justice. That's how you sustain peace. Now, peace and friendship points to how you sustain peace. It's much more significant to link peace with friendship than to just say peace. As I said yesterday, the statute commemorates 30 years of normalization. What President Carter did was terribly important in normalizing relations with Deng Xiaoping in 1979. We all know that. But normalization is a diplomatic term. It's a term rooted in the European concept of state sovereignty. It's a term which implies responsibilities and rights, but only between and among sovereign states, without regard to the people who live within those states. Whatever happens to the people within those states is the sovereign state's business. I don't think President Carter, I know, and I don't think Deng Xiaoping thought that peace alone would be enough for two great nations. They have to move beyond that to something more deeper than normalization.